So I think this especially holds true for RGGI. So first and most importantly, RGGI is not a program. It is not a compact. There is no centralized authority. It's in fact an effort of 11 individual sovereign states working in concert to achieve the most cost-effective carbon reductions for themselves. This distinction is not semantical, but very real. It is reflected in how RGGI operates, with individual states crafting and executing their own regulations. Second, RGGI does not impose a carbon tax. In developing RGGI, the participating states have sought to use market forces to internalize a market externality, revealing a price signal for carbon emissions from the electricity sector to address the cost that is real, present, and indeed growing. Third, there is no joining RGGI. And people often say that as shorthand, but the fact is that states and jurisdictions don't join. States interested in RGGI develop their own independent regulation that enable their state to participate in a common regional auction and gain access to other technical services. Also, RGGI does not operate on a majority rule basis. All shared decisions are arrived at by consensus, and no state is compelled by a majority of other states to take an action with which they would disagree. Only if all states agree on an action do they move forward together. You know, there's this old ancient proverb that says that if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. That's the benefit of consensus, going far together. And RGGI has shown how a group of diverse, independent jurisdictions, through consensus, can go far together. And finally, RGGI is not imposed. Each participating state maintains its participation of its own volition. Any state can choose to begin or cease participation based on its own circumstances and policy preferences. So now I've talked a bit about what RGGI isn't, so let me talk a little bit more about what it is and how it works. RGGI is a cooperative effort amongst currently 11 states with the shared aim of capping and reducing CO2 emissions from the power sector. These states include Connecticut, Delaware, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, Rhode Island, and Vermont. Plus in 2020, we saw New Jersey resume participation after an 8-year gap, and this year, Virginia initiated participation in RGGI. These states seek to reduce power sector CO2 emissions in order to internalize the environmental and social costs being borne by the public. RGGI is a bipartisan initiative rooted in science and free market economics. The story of the start of RGGI goes back to the early 2000s, when a group of neighboring states, recognizing the scientific evidence behind climate change, agreed to coordinate their individual efforts and use market-based forces to address this problem. Both Democrats and Republicans have been in positions of leadership in RGGI, and that bipartisanship continues today, something we are very proud of at RGGI and see as a model for collaborative engagement writ large. Each RGGI participating state has individually decided to develop compatible state regulations so that they may work together, access shared resources, share best practices, and move forward together to address climate change. A challenge that is best tackled through a collective approach that draws upon each state's strengths and experiences. The RGGI participating states have chosen a regional approach for technical reasons that accrue benefits to all participating states. A regional effort is intrinsically aligned with the regional nature of the electric grid as power moves across state lines. And a regional approach to emissions reductions is more cost-effective, as independent experts have affirmed. Also, participation in a regional auction as the primary means for distributing RGGI allowances not only reflects core free market economics, but also enables effective price discovery and efficient lower-cost carbon reductions. And having a regional auction also creates ease of access for market participants in the RGGI states. While RGGI participating states have opted to develop compatible regulations and participate in regional auction format, each state maintains complete sovereignty. and control over every aspect of RGGI implementation in their state, including how they spend the proceeds generated from the RGGI auctions. So let me talk a little bit about RGGI participation. The RGGI states recognize the benefits of a broader market with more participants, as larger markets increase economic efficiency and cost effectiveness, as well as contribute further to the environmental and public health benefits realized by the current participating states. The RGGI states are always open to states considering a path to participation. However, while current participating states have found RGGI to be a powerful tool in meeting their policy and climate goals, participation by Pennsylvania is, of course, only Pennsylvania's decision to make. What we can do is provide information on what other states have experienced over RGGI's decade plus of implementation, including some of the benefits linked to that implementation. As we've noted, their states have full jurisdiction over how to spend their RGGI auctions. In 2008, through 2008, RGGI states have invested over $2.5 billion in RGGI proceeds in energy efficiency, clean and renewable energy, and support for low-income bill assistance programs, as well as other programs to support communities across the RGGI region. Of course, if Pennsylvania were to participate in RGGI, it would decide how to spend its auction proceeds solely based on the state's own priorities and understanding of how to best strengthen Pennsylvania communities. And independent research has also published a number of reports, one on the health benefits of RGGI participation, finding that RGGI states' transition to this cleaner energy infrastructure is saving lives, protecting the health of children, and reducing health-related costs to society. Additional independent reports have shown that RGGI is creating jobs and generating significant economic benefits. Reports on RGGI's first, second, and third control periods have found that the total economic benefits in the region are on the order of $4 billion. It should be noted that RGGI is not an economic development effort, but rather an emissions reduction effort. But the results have shown significant economic benefit to the economy and to communities. I'd also note that since RGGI launched, average electricity bills in the region, including commercial, industrial, and residential, have declined faster in the RGGI region than in the U.S. as a whole. This is supported by the investments that have been made over the years in energy efficiency. So over the course of more than a decade, a significant social, economic, and political change, we have seen the RGGI states embody a constancy of purpose in reducing CO2 emissions while maintaining grid reliability, realizing great economic and health benefits, and reducing costs to consumers. So thank you again for the invitation to testify today, and I hope I have helped in your understanding of RGGI, and we welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you. Who's next? Mr. Zybus?
Yes, she is. Thank you. Chairman Metcalf, Chairman Vitale, honorable members of the committee, good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today on the topic of climate and carbon dioxide. My name is Mark Shevis. I'm the senior attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council, a nationwide nonprofit environmental organization. My job is to advocate for equitable clean energy policies in Pennsylvania, where NRDC has around 17,000 members. My testimony today, which is a abridged version of my slightly longer written testimony, is 3 parts. First, I'll provide an overview of what Pennsylvania and the world need to do to keep global temperatures from rising more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which is what we need to do to avoid the worst effects of climate change. Second, I'll review the approach the General Assembly has taken to energy policy and climate over the last 2 decades. And third, I'll discuss the General Assembly's response so far to the DEP's proposed CO2 budget trading program and regulation, which would enable the Commonwealth to participate in RGGI. In 2018, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a special report called Global Warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. It concluded that to limit the increase in average global temperatures to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and we're about 1.1 degrees now, we have to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions 45% by 2030 and attain net zero emissions by 2050. The consensus emerging from various studies since the IPCC's report is that to achieve this kind of deep decarbonization, we have to 1, generate our electricity from zero carbon sources, especially renewables, 2, electrify our buildings and vehicles, 3, improve the energy efficiency of our buildings and industrial processes, 4, reduce emissions of greenhouse gases other than CO2, like methane, and 5, increase our capacity to remove CO2 from the atmosphere through forest protection, carbon capture, and other practices. To be sure, reducing our net emissions on this scale is a massive undertaking, but it is both possible and affordable, as well as a tremendous opportunity to invest in American workers and families and create a fairer, more sustainable, and less precarious economy than the one we have now. That's why many U.S. states are developing ambitious plans to drive renewable energy, limit carbon pollution, and pursue other decarbonization pathways. There's more detail about that in my written testimony. Pennsylvania, though, has fallen behind. Between 2004 and 2008, the General Assembly took 3 important steps toward a clean energy economy. The Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard Act of 2004 set goals for electric utilities to buy alternative generation, including renewable energy. Act 129 of 2008 required utilities to establish efficiency and conservation programs to help customers save energy and money. And the Climate Change Act of 2008 charged the DEP with assessing the impacts of climate change in Pennsylvania and recommending strategies to address those impacts. Then the fracking boom started, and the General Assembly's priority quickly shifted to promoting shale gas. Among Pennsylvanians, support for clean energy and climate action has increased as the impacts and threat of climate change have become undeniable. Today, majorities of both rural and urban Pennsylvanians think renewable energy holds the greatest promise for addressing Pennsylvania's energy needs. But the General Assembly, frankly, is ignoring those majorities. One timely example is that last month, after 16 years of modest increases, the AEPS reached its modest peak without as much as a hearing on any of the several bills that have been introduced to update it. Meanwhile, due largely to the General Assembly's restructuring of Pennsylvania's power sector in the 90s, Pennsylvania has seen a massive shift in coal-fired power to gas-fired power. For the last decade, gas has been rapidly displacing coal. In 2005, 55% of the electricity produced in Pennsylvania came from coal. By 2019, coal generation was down to 17%, while gas generation is up from 5% in 2005 to 43% in 2019. The reason for coal's decline is simple. Generating electricity from gas got cheaper. Before fracking, coal was generally Pennsylvania's cheapest electricity source and was much cheaper than gas. Then fracking made gas cheap, and investors saw an opportunity to build new combined cycle gas power plants that would outcompete the much older and less efficient coal plants on PJM's gas-friendly markets. And that's what they've done. The result is that since 2010, almost 14,000 megawatts of new gas plants have come online in Pennsylvania, and more than 3,000 more megawatts are close behind. 16 coal plants have closed or announced their closure, most recently the Cheswick Generating Station north of Pittsburgh, which announced its closure on June 10th. How has the General Assembly managed this decade-long transition and the impacts it's had on workers and communities? As far as I can tell, it really hasn't. The General Assembly simply has not addressed the issue in any thorough way. And while some suggest that burning gas is a path to decarbonization, it clearly is not. Although coal to gas fuel switching has led to somewhat lower emissions from Pennsylvania's power sector, it's also led to much higher emissions of methane. And emissions are expected to go up again. Today, Pennsylvania has the 4th highest CO2 emissions among states. The question now facing the General Assembly is what to do in response to the DEP's proposed RGGI regulation. So far, despite Pennsylvanians' strong support for policy action on climate, despite the overwhelmingly positive support of the DEP's public comment period hearings for RGGI with investments in environmental justice communities and coal communities, despite RGGI's clear record of reducing emissions, improving human health, and creating jobs, despite all the investment RGGI would enable in the Commonwealth's communities that need the investment most, so far, despite all these things, the committee's only response has been to advance House Bill 637, a bill that would strip the DEP of its authority to regulate CO2 and replace it not with a counter-proposal to RGGI, but with an onerous new process for any future proposals the DEP may make to regulate CO2. I don't presume I can change any members' minds about HB 637. My question for those of you who support it, instead of HB 1565, Representative Herring's RGGI Investments Act is what you hope to achieve by it. What outcome do you want? The purpose of HB 1565 is to pair the DEP's RGGI program with an investment program that balances investments in clean energy with other types of critical investments in communities adversely affected by the transition away from coal, as well as environmental justice communities that have long suffered disinvestment. What is the hoped-for outcome of HB 637? It can't be investment. HB 637 wouldn't invest a cent. Nor will it stop coal plants from closing, at least not for long. Only stopping the flow of shale gas could do that. All HB 637 would do is block policy to address climate change, and perhaps more importantly, block Governor Wolf. For some members that may be enough, but for Pennsylvanians it's not. They want and deserve more. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to answering any questions you may have and to further discussing this important topic.
And our final panelist in this panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chair Vitale, thanks for having me here, and members of the committee. Today, I'd like to focus my remarks on the opportunities that a 21st century energy economy presents for Pennsylvania communities.